Good morning and good evening to those who are all over the world. Thank you, Professor Jerrold Levinson, for accepting our invitation, and thank you everybody for joining this seminar, which is the second of a series of seminars on philosophy of music organized by the Universities Roma Tre and Tor Vergata. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce Professor Jerrold Levinson. I'm sure many of you will already know Professor Levinson, but briefly let me say something about his career. Jerrold Levinson is Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy at the University of Maryland. His main philosophical interests are aesthetics, metaphysics, ethics, and philosophy of mind. Among the arts, he is particularly concerned with philosophical problems arising in connection with music, film, and literature. Levinson has written on the definition of art, expression in music, emotional response to art, the nature of literary interpretation, and the ontology of artworks. Topics of recent interest include intrinsic value, the nature of humor, jazz improvisation, the ethics of jokes, the analysis of artistic achievement, and the varieties of visual beauty. Levinson has been visiting professor at Johns Hopkins University, Columbia University, the University of London, the University of Canterbury, and many others. The list is very long. He is a prolific writer, so I'll mention just a few books such as Music, Art, and Metaphysics, The Pleasures of Aesthetics, Music in the Moment, Aesthetics and Ethics, Musical Consents, and Contemplating Art. Today he will talk about Sublime music, so thank you, Professor Levinson. The floor is yours.
It's all very fluid, but you'll have 15, if time allows, little musical examples to look forward to. Okay, so I will now leave you guys and try to find my text and read it. There it is. You all still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Introduction. In the foreword to a recent book on contemporary aesthetics, film theorist Murray Smith whimsically remarks that Martian anthropologists visiting Earth would be struck by the disposition of human beings, quote, to invest large amounts of time and energy in activities and experiences lacking any obvious practical payoff, and struck more specifically by the fact that, quote, they spend hours on end engaged with made-up stories told in books or projected on screens, gazing at pictures and objects in buildings designed just for that purpose, museums, and creating abstract sound structures that transfix them. It's with the last of those human inclinations that I am here concerned, involving created abstract sound structures, pieces of music, that transfix human beings in a rather particular manner, and in virtue of which they may be accounted sublime. So the goal of this talk is thus to identify the species of music that is most justifiably denominated sublime, and to characterize it as fully as possible, in part through a suggested taxonomy of the subspecies, illustrated by a wide range of musical examples. Two caveats before proceeding. First, I will put aside the common, more general use of sublime to describe basically any piece of music that is either notably beautiful or highly expressive, since my interest is in musical sublimity as a particular sort of musical quality, one that preserves a connection with the traditional philosophical and romantic notion of the sublime, in particular as that relates to nature. Second, the scope of my inquiry will be restricted to musical sublimity as manifested in works of classical instrumental music of an abstract or non-programmatic character. Though I guess there's some soundtrack musics as well, whether you call that classical or not, it doesn't matter. The reason I'm restricting the analysis to classical instrumental music is to avoid additional complications that attention to language or voice would bring in works making use of such resources. So as many of you know, though, I'm very interested in song and actually applying song myself here and there. This is a talk about sublimity in instrumental music. Section 2, Kant and Schopenhauer on the Sublime. To begin to get a handle on what sublime music might specifically be, as opposed more generally to music that is highly emotionally expressive or strongly evocative of emotion, let's briefly review what two of the most important theorists of the sublime had to say about sublimity in nature, the ground zero of sublimity and its original sphere of application. For Kant, sublimity in the natural world comes in two species, the mathematically sublime and the dynamically sublime. Mathematically sublime phenomena are vast or infinite in extent, and thus are not graspable through sensation or imagination. Yet they can be grasped through abstract thought in virtue of the rational capacity human beings possess, and so, in a way, mastered. Paradigm examples of the mathematically sublime are the night sky with its innumerable stars, desert sands stretching out as far as the eye can see, evoked very nicely in Ellington's Caravan, which I won't talk about, though I just popped into my mind. The ocean reaching to the horizon and beyond, bottomless chasms, endless canyons. Dynamically sublime phenomena, by contrast, are immensely powerful and potentially destructive ones for which we are no match physically, but whose terrible aspect we can perceive without succumbing to fear, provided we are secure from actual danger, and to which we can thus, in a way, feel superior in virtue of our indestructible moral natures. Remember, I'm glossing the way Kant thinks of these two kinds of the sublime. Paradigm examples are lightning storms, raging torrents, hurricanes, volcanoes, avalanches, earthquakes, tsunamis. Schopenhauer, unlike Kant, recognizes only one variety of the sublime, offering a characterization of it designed to cover all its manifestations. In the case of the sublime, he suggests, the ideas evoked by the sublime object are inimical to the human mode of being, and so a shift to contemplation of them occurs only with the willful and active participation of the subject. Contemplation of nature in the case of the sublime requires a forcible and consciously maintained disengagement of the will, whereby the subject manages to, in large measure, bracket the unfavorable relations in which the object stands to human existence in general and the well-being of the subject in particular. Let us now put aside the differences in their conceptions of the sublime and focus just on the commonalities. For both Kant and Schopenhauer, nature is sublime when it presents us with something that threatens or challenges us, whether physically or intellectually, through its immense power or ungraspable vastness, but which we are yet able to confront and to perceive for what it is, and as a result have a distinct sort of experience, an experience of mixed character, involving something like anxiety or fear, but also satisfaction at our ability to hold negative emotion in check, and so persist in the contemplation of the phenomenon. Taking inspiration from the reflections of Schopenhauer and Kant just canvassed, the following hypothesis suggests itself. The essence of the sublime natural object, we might say, is precisely its contraformal character, where this can manifest as either, on the one hand, formlessness or immeasurability, or on the other hand, as destructiveness or overpowering might. Some such objects, the sky, the ocean, the desert, a snowstorm, are contraformal in virtue of their formlessness, that is, their being without boundaries and devoid of articulation. Some such objects, hurricanes, volcanoes, thunderstorms, are contraformal in virtue of their destructiveness, that is, their bringing of disorder, singular propensity to increase entropy, a feature that some people I know have. In contrast to sublime objects so characterized, humans absolutely require form, perhaps being the most highly organized things in the universe. It's thus unsurprising that many sublime phenomena, many sublime phenomena are at base ones that disturb and unsettle us. Of course, it is then puzzling that they should also attract and fascinate us, but we will postpone addressing that puzzlement. Section 3, sublime objects and sublime experience. I don't know why I keep hearing some eruptive noises. Do you all hear that?
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's the sublime, which is irrepressible and is just intruding itself on my sedate and sober discourse. Sublime objects and sublime experiences. A central issue in theorizing the sublime is whether sublimity should be characterized in terms of observable properties of sublime objects themselves, or instead in terms of properties of the distinctive experiences that sublime objects induce. This duality regarding the sublime, whether it is fundamentally a feature of objects or fundamentally a feature of experiences, has been regularly noted. Here's an example, quote, "The word sublime has two related senses. First, it denotes human emotion, a feeling of awe aroused by contemplation of a particularly magnificent, large, or powerful object or event. Second, sublime describes those objects or events thought to arouse the feeling of the sublime." This is from a text by Jeanette Bicknell. Here's another. Quote, "There seems to be an unavoidable ambiguity confronting theories of the sublime. The sublime can refer to a person's feeling and experiences, and the term can be applied to the object that elicits these responses." This is from Robert Cluess. Here is a third, which directly connects the two sides of the phenomenon, defining the object property in terms of its experiential correlate. Quote, "The sublime refers to a certain aesthetic quality that induces awe in the perceiver, a sense of being overwhelmed or overpowered." And this is due to Patrick Drusselin, who is, I think, listening to this discourse. As these quotations suggest, there seems to be widespread agreement that the most distinctive affective reaction to natural phenomena characterized as sublime, and in virtue of which we perhaps so categorize them, is the emotion of awe, usually glossed as some combination of fear, respect, and admiration. However, I would suggest that, strictly speaking, the first of the components figuring in awe is normally not so much fear of a perceived phenomenon as something more akin to heightened awareness of vulnerability faced with the phenomenon's immensity or might. Thus, confronted with a raging sea, a grizzly bear, a hurricane, or the like, then provided one takes oneself to be safe from harm and is freely engaged in contemplating the phenomenon, the negative component involved in the emotion of awe seems better described as an acute sense of vulnerability rather than one of actual fear. In any case, the consensus view seems to be that the sublime is best captured by a distinctive kind of experience, one provoked by a wide range of phenomena, rather than by a characterization of objects taken to typify the sublime. A recent MRI-based investigation into what distinguishes the sublime from the beautiful, whose results showed that the experience of the sublime involved, quote, "a distinctly different pattern of brain activity from that involved in the experience of beauty," end quote, only reinforces such an approach to the subject. Section 4, distinctive properties of sublime objects. Nevertheless, one might still think it feasible to try to identify properties possessed by typical or paradigm sublime objects, properties that conduce to or underlie their propensity to provoke sublime experience. Some candidate properties would be these: obscurity, grandeur, vastness, incomprehensibility, mysteriousness, infinitude, powerfulness, terribleness, unpredictability, fearfulness, destructiveness, unboundedness, strangeness, indeed, threateningness, unfamiliarity. However, the question we must address is this: which, if any, of these properties is characterizable without reference to the distinctive experiences they provoke? That is, which of these properties are directly observable, intrinsic, non-response dependent properties of paradigm sublime objects? For only such properties can serve to characterize sublime phenomena in a manner that's distinct from that turning on whether the phenomenon provokes an experience characteristic of the sublime. Okay, well, some of these properties, overwhelmingness, threateningness, mysteriousness, incomprehensibility, seem clearly inseparable from correlative experiences of being overwhelmed, threatened, mystified, or dumbfounded, and thus is not providing a solution. So where I stopped, I was talking about the fact that it's probably more fruitful to analyze the sublime in terms of the experience of the sublime rather than typical sublime making properties, since that latter tack doesn't work very well. And most of the properties you'd think of are ones that really do require you to fall back on the experience. Okay, now as we come to, at least to me, is the more interesting part of the paper, and a psychological study of sublimity in nature that provided some of the framework for what I'm going to offer as my scheme of categories in the rest of the talk. I now turn to a recent empirical study of the sublime experience of nature. The researchers in question, I think two Spanish researchers, who surveyed almost 300 participants in the Madrid area, found that the distinctive emotion experienced in connection with natural wilderness, taken as a paradigm sublime phenomenon, had two components of variance, one of which is the regularly noted response of awe, the other of which they label inspiring energy. Their fuller characterization of these emotion components or variants is as follows, quote, awe was defined by feelings of fear, threat, vulnerability, fragility, respect for nature, perceived as vast, powerful, mysterious. Inspiring energy was defined by feelings of vitality, joy, energy, oneness, freedom, eternity, and harmony with the universe. We might then formulate the objective correlates of these two varieties of sublime experience as, on the one hand, awesomeness, and on the other hand, energeticness, thus positing the existence of two modes of the sublime that natural phenomena may present, the awesome sublime and the energetic sublime. At this point, I have to make a comment about the way the word awesome has been degraded and corrupted in at least the current American English. It's used to mean just cool or great, but I mean it in a strong sense, that which inspires awe. So it isn't the teenager who likes something and says, oh, that's awesome. It's something that inspires awe. So we have, it looks like, based on that study I just cited, we might posit two modes of the sublime that nature might evoke. The awesome might represent or exemplify the awesome sublime and the energetic sublime. However, I propose that we go further than that. The awesome sublime plausibly divides into two subspecies, one in which awe, with fear or apprehension as its core, is the dominant affect, and one in which wonder, with amazement or cognitive expansion, or sort of mind-blowing at its core, is the dominant affect. If that's accepted, it then makes sense to relabel the awesome sublime more broadly as the transcendent sublime, an experience in which the subject is, in one way or another, transcended, taken out of himself or herself, undone, effaced by either a highly fearful or cognitively ungraspable phenomenon. The transcendent sublime experience is then either of the awful in the sense of awe-inducing or fearful, or the wondrous in the sense of wonder-inducing or astounding. But we must not lose sight of the third sort of sublime experience of nature noted in the study referenced above, an experience of inspiration or invigoration, whose object correlate is something like energeticness. Altogether then, we have reason to recognize three importantly different modes of sublime experience of nature: awe at the fearful or terrible, wonder at the ungraspable or unfathomable, and inspiration or invigoration at the vital or energetic. This is now a parenthetical note about the terminology. In an earlier version of this talk, it was observed to me that I was using ecstatic for this third category that I'm now calling the energetic. Ecstatic sounds fancier, but it was pointed out to me, I think by Enrico Terrone, that ecstatic and transcendent are sort of basically the same, have the same Greek etymology, so that I shouldn't call this third category ecstatic, though I was inclined to originally. So I have instead used transcendent for the first two categories, the awe-inducing and the wonder-inducing, in that they transcend or overcome or take you out of yourself, and then leaving this third category with the label of energetic, in energeticness or something energizingness, where you're actually more fully immersed in your moment, in your life, rather than leaving yourself behind. Let me see if I've anticipated what I'm about to say here. I'll try this anyway. So I'm back to the text that I'm reading. Moreover, there's a significant contrast between the first and the third of these modes, which might be expressed like this. The first two modes involve transcendence or ecstasis in the in ancient Greek, in which you are, as it were, taken out of yourself, whereas in the third mode, involving inspiration and invigoration, you are made to feel, so to speak, even more fully yourself, even more fully present in your experience than ordinarily. Section 6, representations of sublime natural phenomena. How is the sublime experience from representations of sublime phenomena different from the sublime experience from sublime phenomena themselves? We're still dealing with nature yet. We haven't gotten to music. A plausible answer is that the latter is stronger because the fearful or unfathomable object is present and directly perceived. It's right in front of you, hopefully a few miles away if it's really daunting, rather than absent and only imagined. Impressive visual representations, particularly in paintings, of sublime natural phenomena produce an emotion in viewers related to, but not identical to, the emotion that sublime nature produces in viewers who behold sublime objects directly. The former emotion is mediated by imagination rather than perception and is accordingly muted in comparison with its perceptually mediated analog. And though it has something of the mixed character of its real-life analog, the negative component of fear, anxiety, or insignificance prompted by the imagined sublimed object is significantly reduced. Some notable examples of visual representation of sublime nature are paintings of the usually called Hudson River School. Albert Bierstadt is one of these painters. Frederick Church is another. He has an amazing painting of Niagara Falls. Or I would also cite the scenes of conflagration in a film of Terrence Malick, an early film of his, Days of Heaven. Such representations readily facilitate vivid imagined seeing of the sublime phenomenon, which is capable of evoking a similar, if more muted form of the emotion than direct perception of the phenomenon itself affords. But in a different way, the emotion evoked may, in some cases, be even more intense than that had at the real scene, due to the emphases and heightenings effected by the style of representation employed. That could have kind of been something discussed at further length, but I'm not going to take that up at all. Okay, finally, we're going to get to music. Characterizing sublime music, sublime musical experience versus sublime making properties of music. So this is the issue that I raised before about whether we should analyze the sublime in terms of properties or experiences, but now as applied to music as opposed to nature. Should we seek to characterize sublime music in terms of displayed properties of such music, or instead in terms of distinctive experiences that such music engenders in listeners? Note first that a musical work or passage within it may display properties that it neither exemplifies nor expresses. Actually, let me skip over this part of the talk because it has to do with the distinctions between exemplifying, expressing, displaying, and portraying that aren't really crucial. So even if it is to some extent possible to characterize sublime music in terms of observable properties of music, probably a more fruitful approach is to aim at characterizing the experience distinctive of the musical sublime, and that for two reasons. The first is that the connection with the value of the musically sublime would then be more transparent, at least on a view of musical value that ties such value closely to the experiences that music can provide. The second is that a focus on the experiences engendered by sublime music would likely be more amenable to empirical investigation. So let's try to advance our understanding of what sublime experience from music might consist in by analogy with the sublime experience of nature. How is the sublime experience from some musical works both similar to and different from the sublime experience of natural phenomena commonly accounted sublime? The similarity may be that each involves confrontation with and forced acknowledgement of something of exceptional power or magnitude, but the differences are equally salient. In the musical case, first, the degree of fear or anxiety evoked in the listener is surely less. Second, a sense of insignificance is less likely to arise in the listener. And third, the listener is conscious of the object of attention as the product of human invention, rather than the manifestation of something utterly non-human, and so as probably less threatening. Okay, now this is basically the core of the paper. Categories of sublime music. What I will propose is that categorizing music as some species of sublime is at base a matter of what it is most like or most resembles among natural phenomena. For instance, a volcano, a desert, a waterfall. As it happens, those three examples correspond to the three types of sublime music that I will now outline, though this will turn into actually a five-part scheme soon enough. Start with two types, the transcendent and the energetic. The energetic, which used to be called the ecstatic, but I was persuaded not to use that term because it would be conflated then with the transcendent etymologically. Transcendent music comes in two varieties, the awesome and the wondrous, depending on whether the music offers the appearance of an object provoking physical terror or intense trepidation, the awesome, or one provoking mind expansion or cognitive overload, the wondrous, corresponding roughly to Kant's distinction between the dynamical sublime and the mathematical sublime. Characteristic of both cases on the part of the subject is being overcome or overwhelmed by the object with a consequent transcendence or effacement or even momentary obliteration of the self. Energetic music, by contrast, offers the appearance or aspect of an object that is vital, lush, sorry, I'm doing a little correcting here. The appearance of an object that is vital, lush, abundant, and overflowing, that invigorates and inspires. And rather than removing one from the world, such music produces an even deeper, more joyous immersion in it. What follows now is an elaboration of that tripartite scheme, resulting in a scheme that recognizes five distinguishable kinds of sublime music: negatively transcendent, positively transcendent, mixedly transcendent, energizing, and transcendent energizing. Let me explain what mixedly transcendent is. That's music that's transcendent, but seems to combine the awesome and the wondrous, even though they seem to be somewhat opposed. There is some music that seemed to me to have, as there were, both characters, even though they were maybe pulling in opposite directions. And then the fifth category just offered transcendent energizing would be, again, music that seems to me transcendent, taking one out of themselves and also energizing and immersing you in life even more. So therefore, almost paradoxical sort of category. At this point, let me mention to remind my hosts that this is a good time to foreground the handout called Categories of Sublime Music, which I will soon be giving musical examples of. Okay, so transcendent. Oh, I see. My own screen, I haven't corrected this yet. Transcendent music, music which transfixes and transports. Transcendent sublime music divides into two subspecies, TN, TP, depending on whether what predominates in the experience is a negative, terrifying, disturbing element or a positive, wondrous, marvelous element. Negatively transcendent or awesome music. There are examples from Mahler, Penderecki, Ligeti, Xenakis, Krum, Schubert, Mahler. Next category, positively transcendent or wondrous music, where the natural analog characteristic is something like oceanic, expansive, desert-like. And the examples here are from late Beethoven sonatas, from Messiaen's wonderful 20 Regards sur l'Enfant Jésus, music by the Georgian composer Cancelli, by the was it Latvian or Lithuanian composer Arvo Par. Some mixedly transcendent music I find is something by Ligeti, Berg's Piano Sonata, Barber's Adagio for strings, some more of the 20 Regards sur l'Enfant Jésus, and the opening of music for strings, percussion, and celeste by Bartók, perhaps Mahler's Ninth Symphony, the first movement. As far as energizing or exhilarating music, I will have examples from Glass, Philip Glass, John Adams, Schumann, Messiaen, Beethoven, Mozart. And finally, transcendent energizing music, if there is music that seems to be on the borderline of those two categories or somehow fusing those categories. There are some examples I'll have from Beethoven, Scriabin, and Messiaen. Okay, so now I will try to start the musical part of the talk, or rather the sonic part of the talk. And let me change what I'm looking at so as to access that. Okay, I'm now going to illustrate the first of the 5 categories, negatively transcendent music, aka awesome music. I apologize if you're still hearing me, and I have to cut these things off, of course. Okay, that was the opening of Mahler's Second Symphony. Here's a well-known example from Penderecki. E forse sufficiente. Sufficiente. Okay, that was from Penderecki's Serenity for the Victims of Hiroshima. And finally, this is from some soundtrack music to a marvelous film based on a marvelous but somewhat different novel called Under the Skin. That's music written by a composer named Micah Levy. Okay, now for my next category, positively transcendent music, aka wondrous music. Here's one of the 20 looks of Messiaen. And now here's something by Arvo Pärt, or Tabula Rasa. something from late Beethoven. So first, let me check. Are you all still hearing me and the music? Well, I hope so.
Yes, we hear.
And also, it's very painful to cut these things off. At least I find it so. But you know, duty calls. All right. Next, we have what I label mixedly transcendent music. Music that fuses the negative and positive character to some extent, at least in my hearing. So first we'll hear a piece by Ligeti called Lontano. We'll hear a bit of it. And now the beginning of Alban Berg's very singular piano sonata. And third example of this category, the opening of music for strings, percussion, and celesta, Bartók. Okay, and now for the fourth category, energizing or exhilarating music. I have some nice examples. I'm trying to, oh here, I need to move this up to the exhilarating part. Sorry. That was from Glass's film score to the movie Koyaanisqatsi. And now we have another regard on the infant Jesus by Messiaen, very different from the other one. To illustrate the fluidity of my categories, at least at this scheme. At this moment, this selection seems to me perhaps more to belong in the last category. But one more, I think, more unequivocal example of the energizing or exhilarating will be a selection by Mozart, familiar to almost all of you, I guess. Sorry, Wolfgang. Here's one more example. Fits this category, I think. was the opening of Schumann's Fantasy in C major. Performance, of course, makes a difference in getting across these qualities, and this was not actually well chosen to highlight the exhilarating character of the music, but it brought out other aspects of it. Okay, so now I'll move on to the last category of music that somehow combines or spans the difference between transcendent and energizing. And I'll have 3 examples there. Another one by Beethoven. Beginning of the Grosso Fuga. Now a very unusual piece by Scriabin. I'm going to skip ahead a bit. That's about halfway through a piece called Vers la Flamme, Towards the Flame. And the flame is, the end point is really absolutely incandescent, but we don't have time for it. And one more example. This from Messiaen again, but an orchestral piece. Let's see. So that was from Messiaen's Gargantuan Durangalila Symphony, and the section that has the unusual name of Joy of the Blood of the Stars. Okay, so that's it for the musical illustrations. Let me get back to the text that I'm reading. I hope you're all still with me. So this section 9, in a way repeats what has been said so far from the side of, as it were, music finding some sublime thing to connect to it. But this section covers the same ground, but starts with the natural kind, and then suggests and reminds you of what sort of music perhaps corresponds to that. So there's a natural kind F, formless, unbounded, undifferentiated things, like the ocean, sky, desert, snowstorm. Typical reactions to it: wonder, an expansive feeling, cognitive overwhelm. What's foregrounded is our relative insignificance. And this corresponds to positively transcendent or wondrous music. Then there's a natural kind P, P for powerful, powerful, destructive, chaotic things, tornado, hurricane, volcano, earthquake, typical reactions to which are awe, terror, anxiety, shrinking, trembling. And what is foregrounded is our extreme vulnerability. And this corresponds to negatively transcendent or awesome music. Then there's a natural kind V, vital, profuse, abundant, overflowing things, such as waterfalls, rainforests, flocks of birds, herds of wildebeest. Typical reactions: invigoration, excitement, inspiration. And what is foregrounded is our sense of being truly alive. And this corresponds to that fourth category in my scheme now, energizing or exhilarating music. Parallels in nature to the two hybrid categories of the musical sublime that I've proposed hesitantly. The mixedly transcendent and the transcendent energizing are somewhat harder to identify, so I won't even try. What about sublime music versus other valuable musical kinds? I'm now in section 10. Sublime music versus beautiful music, which, as a beginning of my talk, I said some people simply equate these two. And of course, this talk is dedicated to finding out, to defending a conception of sublime music that is specific to sublimity and that connects to sublimity in its home ground of sublime reaction to nature. Sublime music versus beautiful music. Sublime music is obviously distinct from music that's most naturally described as beautiful, such as Debussy's Clair de Lune, Mozart's Piano Concerto 21, Ravel's Sonatine, Poulenc's Sonata for Flute and Piano, or most of the nocturnes of Chopin. Since beautiful music need not evoke any of the emotional reactions central to the sublime, such as those of awe, wonder, or ecstasy, or exhilaratingness. I think I keep forgetting that I've abandoned the use of ecstasy for that last category. Old habits die hard. Sublime music versus chill-inducing music. I've written actually a paper about chills in music elsewhere. Sublime music, such as Barber's Adagio for strings, or the Grid that's the section from Glass's Koyan Scazzi that I played, need not be chill-inducing. And chill-inducing music, such as, at least in my experience, Brahms' String Quintet in G, Opus 111, or Beethoven's Harp String Quartet, or Ernst Bloch's Shlomo, need not be sublime. What's plausible, however, is that pieces capable of producing substantial chills that are cognitively mediated, rather than what I call sort of trivial, purely sonic chills, and that rest on implied emotional narratives, something I address in the paper on musical chills, they are likely to be sublime as well, but they may not be. What about sublime music versus a category it's often linked with pretty closely, profound music? Instrumental music may be said to be profound if it treats of or resonates with some phenomenon of great importance to human beings and appears to offer insight into the phenomenon in question or to provide a novel perspective on it. The phenomenon most often thought to be one that music has a capacity to illuminate is that of emotional life, but the claim has sometimes been made for other matters that music seems to reflect or symbolize, such as modes of growth or development in general, or fundamental aspects of human existence, such as time, fate, and mortality. In a related vein, philosopher Julian Dodd offers as the condition for a musical work to be profound, quote, that the work has a profound subject matter, that the work handles its profound subject matter in such a way as to elicit a deep understanding of it, or a fuller grasp of its significance in a suitably situated appreciator. Dodd here is responding to and sort of modifying a suggestion that Peter Kivy, who is opposed to the idea of profundity in music, had proposed. Anyway, it's clear that profound music, so characterized, and sublime music, as I've here tried to theorize it, are different, though some music may be both. And that might be interesting focus of a further paper or thoughts by anyone as to when profound and sublime music overlap, and to what extent they can overlap. What about sublime music versus a category that we did acknowledge but put aside early in the paper, intensely expressive music? Examples are legion. So I have like 15 examples there. I won't even bother quoting. Okay, I'll just read the name. Brahms, Schubert, Chopin, Bruch, Shostakovich, Bartók, Sibelius. Intensely expressive music is arguably distinct from sublime music. The difference might be captured like this. In its intense expression of human emotion, the former sort of music makes us feel all the more human, rather than confronting us with something that seems beyond human or other than human. Section 11. Is this my last one or almost last? It's my penultimate one. Formal features that conduce to or militate against musical sublimity. This is speculation. I was just trying to think, what is it in terms of musical technical terms that tends to yield pieces of music that have the sublime character in one of the 3 or 4 or 5 modes that I've posited. Sublime music is not likely to exhibit highly familiar formal patterns, such as sonata, rondo, minuet, concerto, because such familiarity of structure in some measure induces feelings of ease or comfort or relaxation, feelings that are opposed to those of mystery, uncertainty, wonder, or apprehension that enter into the distinctly sublime experience. Clear-cut formal patterns tend to militate against the sense of sublimity that music can afford. At least that's one of my speculations. What is conducive to sublimity in music is rather music that is largely homogeneous, that is relatively unchanging, that lacks distinct sections, that eschews conspicuous development, that is without marked directedness or sort of teleological aspect. In short, it's music which readily immerses us, but in which signposts, divisions, and salient goals are mostly absent. Think of some of the most beautiful pieces of Chopin. Parenthetically, why am I talking about Chopin now? Because I was supposed to read this paper at a conference dedicated to Chopin in Warsaw, which may still happen. And the hosts were a bit distressed that I wasn't going to include any pieces by Chopin. The point is that Chopin wrote some wonderful and beautiful music, but in terms of sublimity, it's not clear they are. Think of some of the most beautiful pieces, but I thought I would try to explain that, to sort of apologize in advance for why I did not include Chopin in my list of sublime pieces. Think of some of the most beautiful pieces of Chopin, such as any of the ballades, the Third Piano Sonata, Piano Concerto in F minor, the Mazurka in A minor. That's my favorite, one of those. Though not only beautiful, but also intensely expressive, they're not sublime in the sense we've identified, in part because they are so exquisitely controlled, so firmly constructed, so minutely ordered. They are, despite the passions they express, virtual paragons of form, evincing little of that contraformal character posited earlier as essential to the sublime. Consider by contrast Berg's single movement piano sonata opus 1, which you heard a few minutes of before. This piece does exhibit sonata form with identifiable exposition, development, and recapitulation sections. But what we're presented with phenomenologically is a rhapsodic, tonally freewheeling instance of such form, which doesn't intrude itself in the manner of a template and in no way impedes absorption in the musical flow. As one commentator has remarked on this piece, quote, at a time of disintegration, and what is meant is historically stylistic and cultural disintegration, this sonata, quote, makes disintegration a source of energy and passion, where ideas struggle into affirmation and the struggle gives them life. Consider next Penderecki's Threnody for Victims of Hiroshima that you also heard a bit of. The piece explores the fuzzy border between tone and noise, massively employing notes without precise pitches and tone clusters consisting of all the notes within a given stretch of pitch space, and emphasizing the highest registers of the violins and violas. As a result, it is hair-raising in the nth degree, surely taking the listener to another place, perhaps not all that willingly. Consider lastly the opening movement of Bartók's Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celesta that you also heard a bit of. Bartók, here I'm quoting another music theorist, Hardock based his work on the idea of the fugue, but only on the idea. His meandering, chromatic, metrically irregular subject could never have been imagined in the 18th century, and the form of the movement, a symmetrical shape about a central climax, looks like, you know, like a what is it called, an S sine wave, sort of graph, is unlike that of any earlier fugue. End quote. For our purposes, what matters here is that the unprecedented form of the movement and the unusual 4 measures has a different time signature, make the evolution of the music difficult to anticipate or predict, and thus unsettling and spooky in its unfamiliarity. Okay, I've come to my final section, which is perhaps the most important thing to talk about, but which I have only 3 thoughts here, but perhaps more will come, or some will come from you, I hope. Some rewards of sublime music. 1, a feeling of self-control reflected in sustained contemplation of the fearful or obscure or overpowering sonic object, involving a stretching or expansion of one's perceptual and imaginative capacities, and a milder form of the thrill that contemplation of the sublime in nature occasions. This is one of the rewards of listening to sublime music seriously. Second, a sense of losing oneself, at least for some kinds of sublime music, of partial liberation from one's ego, of release from the everyday in view of absorption in the sublime sonic object. And thirdly, an empathic identification with the sublime sonic object, whereby one imaginatively takes on sublime making properties such as mightiness, vastness, fearfulness, which identification is invigorating and empowering. These sources of reward or satisfaction from experiencing sublime music naturally differ somewhat from one type of sublime music to another, there being, as I have suggested, at least 3 distinct such types, plus different hybrids thereof, thus giving 5 different sorts in sum. And with that, I have run out of text to read to you, and I've run out of breath with which to read it. I have many more sublime examples, but I think there's no more time for me to play them. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
Okay. Thank you, Jerry, for your interesting and intense talk. I think there are many questions for you, and to ask questions, write your name and I will call you to speak following the order.
I'm trying to get the screen back. I don't see where it is now.
Oh.
I just see you, Kia.
Oh, only me?
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know.
Try again.
Let's try launch meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now I see everyone.
Okay, perfect.
If only a talk on sublime music could be as sublime as the music. Impossible.
Okay. There is a question from Elvira Di Bona.
Yes.
Elvira. I think. Okay, one moment.
Okay. Hi, Jerry.
Hi.
So thanks for the talk. That was very interesting. I have to say that I actually agree with the taxonomy you suggested, like the different categories we have within the sublime music. But I have, I guess, 2 questions. One is, so what do you think about sort of this analogous experience that we have when we when we are in front of a waterfall or in a desert, in which it seems that we have a multimodal experience, right? So using all the senses, because I guess that you are not talking about the sublime in paintings, right? When the sublime is represented, but when we, purely experience the sublime in these specific cases. So this is a specific kind of multimodal experience. While when we're listening to music, unless you're listening to live music where maybe you are, in music you have actually a purely auditory experience, right? You might have a multimodal when you go and listen to a live concert, but actually even there, maybe just listening to like your neighbor who is coughing, or just you have sounds which are not really relevant, or maybe you have some kind of you smell something, or you touch the chair where you're sitting in, but is mostly auditory experience. So my question is, can we really find a true way to compare these two constitutively different experiences? One which is multimodal, and the other one is just purely unimodal, namely just by using hearing, just by hearing sounds. The first question. The second question is that, so most of the musical pieces that we listen to have titles which evoke already some atmospheres, some emotions, some feels, like Tabula Rasa or Lontano Atmospheres, which is a piece by Ligeti, or Lato Messiaen, in which the titles already is telling us something about what kind of emotion we are supposed to feel or to experience, right? So I was wondering whether, maybe these are not 100% good examples just because we are already triggered by the title that the composer gave, and so we are already influenced by the kind of sublime or emotion we are supposed to feel when we are listening to them. So what do you think? Instead, when we have, symphony number something, or quartet number something else, or just adagio, well, already adagio maybe evokes something, but just give a number to a symphony, and this is the title of the composition we are listening to, I think it gives us a more neutral piece of music in order to just merely listen to it and to say what we experience when we listen to it. So what do you think about that?
I'm not sure what the second question, so let me take the first one first.
Yeah.
So you point out that the experience of the sublime phenomenon in nature is multimodal. It involves seeing, it involves hearing, it involves smelling. I'm not sure in any natural cases it involves tasting, but anyway, maybe it could. It can involve touching.
Yeah.
So it is a multi-body, but I think that the experience of the sublime in any of those modes I mentioned to a natural object, it still has a sort of unified character, even if its basis is multimodal. So when you have an experience of that kind, you're not actually conscious of, or you don't need to be conscious of how much the contribution is from the visual, from the auditory, from the olfactory, but there's going to be this net sort of distinctive emotional effect, which makes it either an experience of wonder, or experience of awe, or experience of energization. So the fact that it's multimodal, it seems, doesn't mean there's any obstacle to thinking about which kind of music gives me an experience that is similar in the sense of the sort of emotional state or the effect on the ego or the subject that's definitive of that kind of sublime experience, at least on the theory I've offered and the scheme that I've presented. So I think it's an important thing to emphasize that the things you're comparing aren't completely, they differ in their dimensionality. One of them has many more dimensions to it, because as you say, the non-auditory aspects of the music are sometimes relevant. There's lots of discussion about how important it is to be seeing the performance and seeing the performance gesture. I think most of that, even though I think gesture is very important, I think the imagined gesture is what's important, not seeing the gesture on stage. But anyway, it's minor, even if you think there is some contribution there. So the fact that one of them is in some, or in push comes to shove, can be gotten in purely auditory way, and you're comparing that to an experience that has a multimodal basis. I don't think that makes any difference. It's not an obstacle. It's just something that's worth being aware of. Now, the second thing is whether the titles in some of these pieces influence the kind of experience you have of it, and thus would influence your categorization as sublime or not, and as this kind of sublime rather than that kind of sublime. Sure, I think that some of those titles will have that effect, but I think most of the examples, I might even say all the examples, would, I think, be characterized that way even if there had no titles. So sure, the Berg Sonata has no title except Sonata Opus 1, and the Penderecki does have that title, which evokes something very horrible in human history. But I don't think I think it would have that character even if it didn't have that title. It wouldn't have the character of feeling the intensity of the screams and shrieks of victims of a nuclear explosion. It wouldn't have that particular character, but it would have very much this awesome, not in the cool sense, the awesome, awe-inducing sense that it has because of its sonic qualities and its the way it crosses the boundaries between noise and note, and the way it has no obvious sort of form to it. So I think that's largely the case. But let me look at my examples and see if I think the title really makes an important contribution to the kind of experience you have of it and how you characterize it. Maybe in the part it would. The fact that it's called tabula rasa and that particular section is called silentium makes you more likely to hear desert-like thing in it, or related to experience of the desert than an experience of a waterfall. So it might make an effect in some cases. So if you acknowledge that, does that change whether it is sublime in that way? I don't think so, but you could just sort of have a footnoted description. It's sublime to this degree and in exactly this way if you don't think of the title, and it's sublime in a slightly different way or slightly more specific way if you are taking the title into account when that title seems to make a difference. Yeah, so I hope that gets no,
maybe it's just a very small follow-up. Maybe because I thought that when we experience the sublime, we are supposed just to be there and listen to it, listen to a piece of music, listen to have sort of experiential thing, like an experience of music. And then in the second level, you will tell me what's the title, probably. And so the question is, if you tell me the title before, I'm supposed to be like influencing what I'm experiencing just by the title you're giving it, like just by the concepts I'm employing when I am listening to it. Like tabula rasa is a clear title which evokes something like desertic or like empty or something like that, right? So I was thinking maybe with the sublime we're supposed to feel it just by the mere audition, right, of a piece of music. But of course, then, I mean, what you say makes sense to me anyway.
Well, I think we agree that I think in almost all the examples, the auditory content is doing the work. And if there were no titles, it would pretty much be experienced the same way, but not with a complete specificity of the sort that the title will suggest.
Okay, thanks.
The next is Filippo Focosi.
Ciao, Filippo.
Ciao, Jerry. It's nice to see you. Yeah. Hello to everyone. I'd like to ask you a thing. All the examples of sublime music that you made, in my opinion, are also beautiful, are also examples of beautiful music. And this is due to the fact that they are well structured. They possess formal balance, And when I think at purely sublime music, something of such as a musical analogous of Pollock, a Pollock painting, for instance, I think of Morton Feldman's string quartet, or Lamont Young early works, or pieces by John Luther Adams or Kevin Volans, pieces which try to overcome form, or even overcome content. So the question is, do you think that in the examples that you made, the sublime quality can coexist with a beautiful quality, or do you think that they are purely sublime pieces of music, or if there is the possibility that a purely sublime music which is not beautiful at all can exist?
Okay, well, I heard two questions in your comment. The first is something that I tried to put aside at the beginning of the talk, that I wanted to identify sublime music in a sense that it was more specific than the idea of beautiful music, where beautiful music just means aesthetically good music of any sort. And I've written a paper on this topic you might know. It's called Musical Beauty, where I talk about what is this narrower concept of musical beauty and what is the broad concept. The broad concept is music that is aesthetically good. So clearly sublime music will be beautiful in that broad sense, where it's just equivalent to aesthetically or artistically good music or valuable music. But it won't be equivalent to beautiful music in the narrow sense that something like Debussy's Clair de Lune exemplifies. Now, the other part of your question or comment was about composers who compose in ways that even more formless than say the Penderecki, like Morton Feldman. I was thinking that I felt guilty that I didn't include anything by Morton Feldman, because I knew one of my friends, fans who might be at this talk is a great proponent of it. I'm sure there is some music of Morton Feldman that might count as sublime, but since the things I know of Morton Feldman, I often can't even hear them. This is so little there that I don't know if they give me the experience of the sublime. But I suppose that they might, and I'd have to think of what category that they would fall under. So formlessness, formedness, and formlessness is a continuum. So there's a sense in which the Penderecki, there's a sense, at least I'm at least presupposing, where the Penderecki or even the part is not as formed as what you get in the typical Beethoven or Mozart or Brahms sonata structure. Now, maybe that's, you would challenge that there is such a difference there. I mean, maybe you could put it just this way, that when you're listening to music, you're just not sure where it's going or what it's doing. That is true of a lot of the examples of sublime music, which you might be enjoying, even though you don't know exactly what it's doing or where it's going. But it's not going to be true in almost any of the classical repertoire or classical romantic period of 2 centuries. So, did you mention someone else besides? Oh yeah, Terry Riley.
Yes, especially composer that I don't know if you know him, is Kevin Volans, South African composer who is inspired by African music and by Morton Feldman too, and he tries explicitly to overcome form and even overcome content. So he may be a good example too of sublime music.
Would Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds also be an example of?
Well, for me, it's not a piece of music at all. So
well,
another category.
Again, I'll just recycle the same joke. For me, most pieces by Morton Feldman are probably a few steps away from 4 minutes 33 seconds. But maybe I need to cultivate my tolerance of very minimalist music.
Yes, I like minimalist music, as maybe you remember.
Well, I mean, I like minimalist music when that label used to apply to Reich and Kate and Glass. Yes, I like that music, but that music isn't minimalist in the sense of that.
Yes, the different sense of minimalism. Thank you, Jerry.
One last comment just to make it even clearer, to beat a silent horse here, is less is more. Less is more is taken to the limit almost by Morton Feldman. But I'll have to go back and try to like Morton Feldman in the future. So I do try to be Catholic. And sorry if I intrude this, but maybe someone knows the answer to this. In English, when you say you have Catholic taste, you mean it's very broad-minded, embracing. But how is it that the Catholic Church and doctrine, which isn't associated in the usual thought with that kind of character, how did that become a word for broad, accepting, open-minded? Does anyone know? Anyway, so I when I say I have Catholic taste,
Aperto.
I don't know how that happened. The Catholic Church is very clever, I think.
I think there is another question from Kim Jason Villeska.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Yes. Thank you for this opportunity to ask this question to Professor Levinson. Professor, I'm currently writing my master's thesis. I am a graduate student in the Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas, Manila, Philippines. And I am currently working in the aesthetics of music of Schopenhauer. And I am proposing a nuanced interpretation that is that there are two intertwining delimiting elements of Schopenhauer's musical aesthetics. I would really want you to comment on this if it is not that much, because you also mentioned Schopenhauer in this discussion. One of the reasons why silence, I think, is so pervasive in Schopenhauer's account of music is that in an attempt to escape the demands of knowing or the relation of things to one another under the principle of sufficient reason, he is a sort of philosopher who pushes us back to appreciate the appearance of things. With this, music is to be accepted as the appreciation of the appearance of things for their own sake without any purpose in mind. And the most appropriate response for such contemplation is silence, because the oral representations of music can only point us to the inherent silence of the will, bereft of any particularization and individuation. And I also argue that the musical profundity in Schopenhauerian terms therefore becomes possible not because we are capable of articulating what it means to be. Rather, it allows us to realize the extent of our freedom and the limits of our knowledge as embodied beings. That is why I argue that musical profundity, in the sense or arising from the sublimity of music, is enabled by the silence of music itself, as it leads us to a realm where oneself is liberated from the throngs of desires and affections, and that only the essences of things are grasped. It is as if a nirvana that arises from the suspension of our knowing, as music enables us to clarify the fundamental aspects of our human condition. And that of silence is the ultimate response to the beautiful and the sublime. And therefore, any articulation is a reverence of the experience of the sublime or ineffable.
Okay, well, I didn't recognize too much in your account of Schopenhauer's view of music in my view of Schopenhauer's account of music, which I have written about. I have an essay on Schopenhauer's aesthetics in a book called Contemplating Art. So one of the things you put the emphasis on is that silence is the most valuable aspect of music, or when music is silent is when it is achieving its purpose most completely. I just don't quite understand that idea. What I focused on in thinking about Schopenhauer's reflections on music is how it is he treats music, how he treats music. what's that? How he treats music is different from any of the other arts. And it's sort of it's puzzling why he should like music at all, since music to him is the most direct, unfettered, and unfiltered representation of the will, which, as you know, of course, is the source of human suffering and of the horribleness of the world. This is why Schopenhauer is called a pessimist, somewhat unfairly. So the thing is, music should seem like a torture to us, since it rubs our nose in this horrible will that is the source of all unhappiness. So I just, whereas the other arts, of course, are arts that do take us away from our willful, horrible, ego-driven selves, but in a temporary sense, because they, unlike music, are not direct reflections of the will, but they're reflections of, as you know, the world of ideas or representations. And so they take us away from our spatio-temporally causally rooted selves and give us a temporary release from that in a way that is like some of what's in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. So I'm just having trouble reconciling my knowledge or view of Schopenhauer with what you said. So I don't know if I have anything else to add.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, well, good luck with your project, it's certainly an original reading of Schopenhauer, I will say that.
Thank you.
There is a question from Chris Mashari.
Hey, Jerry, thanks for the talk. So I have, I don't know if it's a clarification question or just a lack of coffee question, but I was hoping you could elaborate on the relationship between familiarity and the sublime. So I guess you said that it's difficult or impossible to have a sublime experience if the thing that you're experiencing is very familiar, so it's structure or form or whatever. And I'm just wondering, so say there's a sublime piece that you're used to, you've listened to it many times, and so now you're familiar with everything about it, you can predict like the next portion of the song or whatever. In your view, does this make the piece less sublime over time, or is there some sort of other measure?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, the first part of your question, you were reacting to my speculations about which musical or technical features conduce to sublimity or work against sublimity. And there are something like clear-cut form does, I think, work against sublimity. But the second part of your question is, I guess, saying, well, doesn't the clear-cutness of the form augment just when you just become familiar with the piece? So, so those are two different points. So I'm not sure if you had a worry about whether my suggestion that less clear-cut form, at least initially, conduces to sublimity more than clear-cut form. But then the second point, second remark was that whatever degree of, as it were, in the abstract formedness or clear-cut form a piece of music has, if you listen to it more, you become familiar with that, and therefore the sublimity should get less. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but somehow I think the answer is no, that it doesn't get less. But now I'm wondering why, if that's consistent for me to say that it doesn't get less when you become more familiar with the form, so that for you, the form becomes, as it were, more clear cut. I think even when you become familiar with a piece, if it has an intrinsically less formed character, I know this is a contentious thing that not everyone will accept. When you become familiar with it, I don't think that affects the way in which its sonic features, its timbral character, its the way it sounds will undercut its sublimity if it does seem analogous to one or another natural phenomena in the 3 or 4 modes that I talked about. That question was all over the place, but did some of it get at your remark?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something interesting. So if you just were to accept that familiarity somehow undermines the sublimity of a piece, it sort of suggests a certain normative constraint on listening, right? So you might not want to over-listen to a certain piece. I guess that's why, you might think of it as a certain sort of I don't know, like a ritual or something. You don't want to overdo it, otherwise it sort of undermines the sort of connection you have to it. And that actually seems intuitive. So I don't know if it's really
I absolutely agree with that. I've long held that you should never, play the piece right again. Occasionally, maybe one rehearing soon after you've heard it, if you really like. You really shouldn't wear it out. But I think this applies to music in general, that you really want to give things a rest between hearings, so that their inherent ability to transform you and make your life richer is sustained as long as possible. So I don't think it's a particular feature of Sublime music. It's a feature of any music. You don't want to wear it out. So I totally agree with that. But maybe you still think that that this is advice that is more important for sublimity. That if it's beautiful in that narrow sense I was talking about before, hearing it many times in succession without enough sherbet chaser between the hearings isn't so bad. But that with Sublime music, it really will undermine the sublimity more than, say, doing that will undermine the beauty. Is that something you're still maintaining?
Yeah, that sounds natural to say to me. So.
Yeah, if it's good, don't wear it out. On the other hand, there's another factor. Of course, some aestheticians, especially who've done experiments, have talked about recently and written about, is that almost anything sounds better if you listen to it a few times. And this is basically with the success of popular music. The worst of it sometimes, after a few hearings, it's going to get into your head. Then you'll get sick of it very soon. But it's amazing how the second and third time you listen to something you think was terrible garbage, suddenly sort of seems, well, it's not so bad. Because just getting something into your head so that you're anticipating and sort of moving with its gestures and inflections, it's satisfying, even if it's a very bad example of what we can do with music. I don't know if other people have this observation that almost anything sounds good on the second or third hearing, at least better than it used to. But then it might be very quickly falling off.
Thanks.
There is another question from Guerreiro Vitor.
Hello, Jerry. Nice to meet you.
Vitor,
thank you for the interesting talk. My question concerns the musical examples. Usually, these sort of examples involve the tradition of Western classical music broadly construed. I was wondering, could we pinpoint examples in other traditions, like non-Western or non-classic within the Western? Or is there some deep reason why we go back to these examples within the Western classical canon? Just that.
No, there's no reason why there wouldn't be Sublime music in all of those modes in other musical traditions. This is one I know well, so I can suggest what examples are plausible. I'm sure that in Northern Indian music there are passages and pieces that would count as Sublime by this sort of criterion. What other traditions? Some Japanese genres I can think of. Music for the shakuhachi, but it's just harder to feel that you're on solid ground in your experience of music from another tradition, unless you are really immersed in them for a long time and can make fine distinctions. On the other hand, and this of course is a very risky thing to say, it might be that some musical cultures have a greater range of what they can express than others, and maybe the Western musical tradition is notable in that regard. So maybe there would be more ways to create Sublime music in that tradition, but that may be unfair. Do you have some particular musical tradition or genre that you think would be a likely source of?
Well, I wasn't thinking about specific examples. I was just wondering whether this thinking about if we try to listen to, for instance, Indian classical music or whatever, and listen to the sublime there, to what extent would that be imposing a foreign aesthetic category, like trying to reverse, for instance, applying the categories like wabi sabi to Western art or something. If there wasn't if the reason, I was wondering whether the reason the examples keep returning to classical music, if this wasn't culturally relative phenomenon about the I don't know, but I wasn't thinking about any specific examples that could.
Well, unless the emotional correlates of these sublime objects are culturally relative, that is to say that you just don't have these kinds of experiences or emotions in other cultures, then I don't see why a different musical tradition might not be able to present the appearance of these kinds of natural objects that generate those kinds of emotions. I mean, there has been, as you know, work on the specificity of emotions in different cultures that don't have exact equivalents in other cultures, like saudade as an example is used sometimes, special kind of nostalgic sadness in Portuguese or Brazilian. But acknowledging that doesn't suggest that somehow the category of the sublime, defined in terms of certain kinds of emotions or certain sort of correlative objects, that one is grounded in Western culture, would not have application elsewhere. There's no reason why it wouldn't have application elsewhere, but the proof will be in the pudding. You have to see if there are other musics that to people well versed in those musical cultures and familiar with these Western categories can put together to see whether there are other musics. But I mean, I would, if I would listen to lots and lots of North Indian ragas, I might like them. I might find them full of emotion, but I wouldn't be sure what emotions they are, and I wouldn't know which one was sublime and which one weren't. I mean, I just don't have that degree of immersion in it. But I have no reason to think in advance that that kind of distinction, that one is beautiful, that one is awesome, that one induces awe, that one induces serenity or wonder, why that wouldn't happen.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, but just staying with our tradition, of course, I was thinking when you began your question, and I know something about your interest, that you might have said, well, what about looking for examples of the sublime in Western non-classical music? Are there such examples? I'm sure there are, but again, most of that, of course, is vocal music, is music involving song, text, in which the issue of whether the music itself is music without the words and the text and the story is generating these feelings or experiences is unclear. But I mean, when I think of what the rock music I'm familiar with, I try to think of parts without any words or text. Well, I think there must be some such, but it's hard to come up with. Maybe some of Pink Floyd might be like that, or I mean, I think of my favorite piece by what's it called, Mark Knopfler, Dire Straits, Sultans of Swing. But I mean, there's something sort of transcendent about that wonderful piece. But it's, you know, there is a story, there are words. It's hard to detach it from that. But someone who's more of an expert on the purely instrumental aspects of rock and pop music, might come up with some plausible examples.
Maybe krautrock would be a field to explore there.
What was that?
Krautrock, the West Berlin rock in the West Berlin rock 60s, 70s.
Okay, I heard what I heard. I didn't catch the word. I heard the word caoutchouc.
Yeah, a lot of
word for rubber.
Krautrock.
I don't know what that is. Or maybe some punk rock, I guess, could be offered as an example. I just don't know. Yes, and Nirvana. That's like post-punk rock. Oh, there's something I really disliked when I used to hear it. And then suddenly at some point I said, hey, that Teen Spirit is really not bad. listening to things a few times is a very good recipe just for increasing your enjoyment of them, leaving aside rating them or deciding whether they're sublime or not.
Okay. Tiago, Sousa, it's your turn.
Hello. I have a simple question. Is the relation between sublime and profundity? If I wonder if there is simple to find music there that is sublime but is not profound. I wonder if it's easy to find music that it's very profound but it's not sublime. If the relationship between profundity and sublime is that the profundity could be a type of sublimity. I don't know if what you say about that. Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting question. If you grant, though, that they're not equivalent concepts, not equivalent categories, which might seem to you, at least off the top of your head, as a broader category. Now, what you last said was, I think that profundity might be a species of sublime.
Yeah.
Sublime would be the broader category, or the other way?
Yeah. The sublime, the profundity is a type of no. The profundity is a type of sublimity. The very profound, very profound music.
Yes, so sublime would be the bigger category.
Yeah.
I see it more as the typical Venn diagram that have some overlap, but neither one is broader than the other.
Can you give me an example that music that is very profound but is not sublime?
Okay. I might. I don't know why this example came to mind, but Strauss's Oboe Concerto. And people who play the oboe, I don't know how anyone can play something like that, but people who can should be really grateful that Strauss wrote that concerto, because it is. Now I have to be careful which one did I need for my point. I guess that's profound music. Profound in the sort of depth of emotion and the nuance of emotion that its trajectory outlines. But I don't think it's sublime music in the sense that I don't think it doesn't induce wonder or awe or invigoration particularly. Do you happen to be familiar with that piece? Strauss's Oboe Concerto? Well, give it a try. So that would be an example, I think, of music that is profound, maybe, but a little more confidently not sublime. But it is very beautiful as well, to take up another categories we, of course, have on the table. But and that's beautiful, even, I guess, even in the narrow sense of beautiful, not just artistically good. Let's try the other one. So that's an example of something that's profound but not sublime. What about something that's sublime but not profound? Well, I think there are many more examples.
Yeah, that's easy, I think. Okay. Which is that are sublime.
So maybe I'll rest with one good example on the other side. And pass on to something else I can answer or evade answer.
Good. Thank you.
I see Ines has a hand up.
Yeah, indeed. I think she disappeared. I don't know if it is. Ines Moraes.
She's still there.
Oh, one moment.
We have to unmute. Oh, there
yeah, now.
Okay. I have two questions. The first one, let me just close this. The first one, I think it was partially answered already, is how does the sublime relate to the beautiful? So how are the two related? I know this is a basic question, but I never understood this. And the other one is the sublime typical of sacred music because of the awesome and all that? Is it typical or it's not related in terms of theme?
Okay, well, the sublime and the beautiful. There's a narrowly and a broadly use of beautiful. Beautiful in the broad sense is artistically good music of any sort. So that's a very broad category. But in the narrow sense, beautiful music is something that's harmonious, soft, appealing, easy to listen to in some sense. And sublime music obviously doesn't have to be that way. And could it ever be that way? Well, I guess there might be some sublime music in the subcategory of wondrous music that would be beautiful, and maybe the opening of the Andante movement at the end of Beethoven's 30th piano sonata would be an example of that. So it's beautiful and sublime in the wonder-inducing mode. No, but the other question is there a special connection between sublime music and religious
Sacred music, yes.
and sacred music? Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, there are some of the masterpieces of sacred music that do strike me. I haven't thought of this before, because I was putting aside voice and text and story and narrative as I guess if any sort of music would be sublime, it would be some of those monuments, like the Bach Mi minor mass, or the St. Matthew Passion, or some of the sort of, I don't know what they're called, like they're called little cantatas of Heinrich Schütz, are overpowering in their in depth and movingness. So I haven't even thought about how to categorize that music in terms of sublimity, but because I simply put it aside, music that had the religious text of any kind. But I'm sure that a lot of that would actually count as sublime.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll have to think about that further.
Thank you. Thank you. They're very interesting. Thank you.
There is another question from Eduardo Torres.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, Jerrold. That was a really great talk. I got very excited and also very surprised by the whole trolling. That was the first time I've experienced that.
Oh, the interruptions.
Yeah,
yeah,
the interruptions. It was kind of funny, to be fair. I have a question that's more related to. So this comes from a personal issue. I started first doing music theory. I started studying music theory, and then I moved to philosophy, and now I'm doing a PhD in philosophy. So my question is, when a philosopher of music comes forward with a taxonomy like yours, what is exactly the role of the philosopher of music? Is the philosopher of music different from a highly theoretical music critic, or is it? What's the point of coming up with? I don't mean this to sound in any form dismissive or anything, but what's the point of coming up with a philosophical taxonomy like yours? Is it to be used by musicologists? Is it to clarify the work of musicologists? I'm asking these questions because I'm obsessed with music, and I'm split between philosophy and music, and trying to put them together in a way that I find satisfying. I always end up asking, but how can I do that? Like, how do I have to be a musicologist in order to fully engage? Do I have the necessary knowledge to come up with ideas or things to say about music, or does my knowledge of philosophy sufficient to just I don't know, say things about music? That's my question.
Well, your question seems to.
How do you see
metamorphose a bit during
your role,
the framing of it? But so let me just take the last thing you said. Do you have to be a musicologist to do philosophy of music? Was that part of the question? I think, no, you don't have to be a musicologist. But it's not a bad beginning. I mean, there are some notable philosophers of music who started as musicologists. Stephen Davies is one. Justin London is another. Mark DeBellis, though I'm not sure what's coming from lately, is another. So it's not a bad place to start. But I think you can be a philosopher of music if you simply have a great, or reasonable knowledge of music, both the repertoire and the practices and the history of music. You can know those things without being a musicologist per se. So I am not a musicologist. I just pretend to be a musicologist sometimes. Let's see. I took 2 music courses in university, and then I audited a music theory course once I was a faculty member at Maryland. I did learn some useful stuff from that course. I have a few chops, but I won't go into them. But they're nothing compared to, say, the ones that the departed Roger Scruton had. Let me see if I can say something more useful on this question. Oh yeah, so what's the point of a taxonomy of Sublime? Partly it's to answer, at a minimum, it's to give some reasoned basis for the description of music as sublime, because too often people use it very loosely, and you don't understand why they're calling that music sublime, whether they have in mind anything like what anyone else has in mind. And so the virtue of my talk, if there is any to it, is to ground an account of the species and the uses of sublime in something like sublime in its natural habitat, namely the sublime in relation to nature, which is fairly developed. And so that's what I tried to do, is to sort of use the sublime as a phenomenon, as a kind of way of describing the world, and a kind of experience that has been had to nature since time immemorial, as a basis for grounding and sort of there's a word Quine used to use, regimenting. The way we use sublime in musical criticism and in just sharing impressions or assessments of music with one another as music lovers. Yes, music lovers, of course, are my main target audience. Musicologists can listen, musicians can listen, music psychologists can listen, but my main target is music lovers. Whether they are any of those things as well is fine, but it's not what's essential. If you don't love music, you don't care about
if you allow me to come with a brief follow-up. One of I'm writing precisely a paper about it, and it seems that your position is commonly held by other philosophers of music, and you're trying to come up with a sort of descriptive approach to the concepts of the common folk to music. You said that your audience is the music lovers, not the musicologists, not the musicians themselves. But I think that
my target is also, of course, is those who want to criticize music. So music critics should pay attention to some of the things that philosophers of music do, because it's partly clarification and analysis, investigation of what's involved in music criticism in the broad sense, not necessarily published, but when we evaluate, describe, interpret music, either in terms of our writing or thinking about it, or of course in terms of our playing of it. That's another sense of interpreting. So the thought of ordinary music lovers about music is one of the targets of analysis, but also what goes on in music criticism in broad sense is another target of analysis that can be of some use to music critics. I mean, I don't know. I can call up Alex Ross. I don't have his phone number, and ask him whether he's writing philosophy can help him write music criticism better. Probably the answer would be no. But I think couldn't hurt, and some music critics could stand, I think, to look into philosophy of music.
Yeah, that's Thank you very much for your. I feel very reassured of continuing my path in philosophy of music. I was still going to do it, but it does feel reassuring.
Well, another reason why to continue in that path.
Thank you, Joe.
Philosophy and music are two of the greatest things there are. So if you can do them both, as it were, you're even better off. I have, that's a thought actually that I expressed in another little paper you can look into sometime called Philosophy and Music. It was published in an Italian journal, I think, called Oboe. Is that that's the name of it? Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
There you go.
I think there is the last question from Nicola Bernardini, but I think he left the talk, so I don't know. I read his question for him if you want to reply. I don't know, it's late. How much the ability of perceiving the sublime in music is exquisitely cultural, that is requiring cultural ability?
Yeah, well, that question was broached in one or two of the questions we've already dealt with. I guess the thing to say is that the category of sublime in nature and by extension or analogy in the arts, and in particular to music, is native to Western culture. But the fact that concepts and schemes of description and typologies of emotion are native to a given culture doesn't mean that they can't have application elsewhere. So that's an open question. There might be some very specifically Japanese, say, concepts or notions about what the world is like or how to live and so on that we in the West are unfamiliar with. But once we grasp what they are, we might see whether in fact they do, though we wouldn't have used the Japanese word, of course, they do apply to some things that we have in our experience of the world or in our world, period. And that the origin of concepts or scheme of description in a given culture doesn't mean that it's restricted to things that are in that culture. Depends on whether it has legs, as I say in publishing, I think, or in the media world. Does it have legs? Can it travel? Can it fly elsewhere? Well, you have to see.
I think so. Okay, I think there aren't other questions. So it's late. Thank you, Jerry. Sorry for the initial technical problems.
Yeah, okay.
We didn't expect.
The Zoom world is a new world, and hopefully we won't be in it that much longer. But thank you all for listening and for the feedback. And
I hope to see you in person very soon in Rome, in College Park. And I'd like to remind you that the next seminar is on 16th of April with Professor Jane O'Dea from University of Lethbridge on ethical challenges of musical performance. So you are all welcome. Thanks again, Jerry, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, and what can I say in leaving you but arrivederci, Roma.
Arrivederci.
Ciao, Jerry.
Ciao, grazie. Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye.